Hello, good day. We are going to have a recording of our class. So this will be on chapter 7, the repetition control structures. So a repetition control structure is also known as a loop. So it's a control structure in programming language that controls the execution of specific code or specific statements multiple times, hence the term loop. In contrary to the conditional control structures that we have discussed on previous chapters, the repetition control structures, thus the name, it will going to repeat the execution of the statements inside our block, or should I say in a block of codes for a given condition and for a given parameters. So in simple words, si conditional control structures will identify kung i-execute or dili ang code, whereas if we talk about repetition control structures, we are more or less determining kapila na to pabalik-balikon o execution ang specific parts sa itong mga codes. Example of this problem that can be solved is this one. So basically, we have a basic problem here, or a elementary programming problem here. So make a Java program to display hello world 5 times. And this is very easy, even not using loop, it can be solved by this code. So for this example of the solution, we have declaration of class, declaration of our main method, and we have to use the system.out.print 5 times in order for us to solve the problem. And that can be solved even without the utilization of this, what we call as loops. Now, let's make the problem a lot complicated at some point. So instead of printing it 5 times, let's change it into 100 times. So if you're going to solve this problem, you might be encountering at least 104 lines of our code. 100 will be allocated for the system.print hello world, which can be grabe kataas, and length in terms of our source code. Now, this can be solved in shorter lines, which is a sort of in terms of programming. At some point, shorter number of lines of execution is more efficient in some way. So if you're going to use loop for this problem, we can have at least around mga 7 lines to be able to execute or to run the solution for the problem. So in this sample code here, we only have system.out.print hello world once, but it will generate 100 lines given that we have included what we call as a looping statement, to be specific, a for loop. So this will execute the specific number of line 100 times, and it will execute the same way as printing or specifying system.out.print 100 lines in your source code. Okay? So another problem here that can be solved using repetition control structures or loop is to require the user to re-enter the correct username and password unless the accepted information or combination is inputted. So just like your typical login, your typical login sa mga websites or softwares, it will require the user to enter or to re-enter if the password did not match or the email doesn't exist or etc. Okay? So repetition control structures can be used in this problem. Another is mathematical computations. One of the common or yung pinakasikat in terms of learning programming in basic in terms of loop is the Fibonacci series. At the same time, solving for prime numbers and similar ng mga mathematical computations. And this is just some of the problems that can be solved using loop, or should we say the repetition control structure. Now, in Java, we have 3 basic loops that we can use. This is the while loop, the do while loop, and the for loop. Okay? Depending on our needs, depending on the need of the problem, we're going to identify each and ano yung pinaka-best to be utilized in terms of the structure that we're going to use in loop. Now, first is the for loop. So the for loop is used if we know the iteration or the number of iteration of our execution, meaning the number of iteration is fixed. So if we know that we're just going to print to execute 100 times, 10 times, 30 times, or 40 times, and di na siya mag-change, we're going to use the for loop. Again, we use this one if the iteration is fixed or we know exactly how many times the code or the part of the code nga itong ipa-repeat will be executed. Now, the while loop and the do while loop shared similar na aspect, meaning dili fix ang number of iteration, unlike the for loop. Okay? So if we don't know how many times because it's either being controlled or according sa user na input, um, for example, yung kanina, yung username and password, we don't know how many times masype ang user to enter the password and the username combination. So it's not controlled. Okay? We don't know exactly how many iterations and how many times the user will input it incorrectly. So we're going to use the while loop or the do while loop. Now, the difference of these two loops are, if we want to execute at least once sa atong loop, we use the do while. Okay? If pwede ra nga dili ma-execute ang atong code because we will get to set kasi conditions, we use the while loop. So again, to sum this three up, if we know how many times the code will be executed, use for loop. If we don't know, use either while or do while. Now, in identifying the while or do while nga gamiton nato na loop, try to answer the question, is it necessary for us or is it necessary for the problem that you are going to run the part sa imong code sa imong iteration once? If the answer is yes, use the do while. If dili required nga mo execute at least once ang imong gisulod sa loop, use the while loop. Now, also, there are four components of a loop. It is the initialization, condition, which is similar to the if nga na structures. We have also the increment and decrement. So we are going to use here the increment and decrement operators. And also fourth will be the statement for execution. Now, every type of loop in Java, naani sila upat ka buok present, and it is what we call as main composition of a loop. Dili mo work ang loop kapag naay kulang ani nga mga components sa iyaha. Okay? Again, regardless if you're using the for loop, the do while, or the while loop, these four should be present. Now, first is the initialization. Initialization is just elementary programming, more on the declaration of a variable. Okay? It is the initial condition that is executed once when the loop starts. So we initialize if we set it to 0, if we set it to 1, or we set it to 100 until maabot sa to 0. Okay? So this part will initialize the variable or use an already initialized variable or i-reset na to ang values of variable. It is an optional condition. Okay? But although it is an optional condition, but it should be part sa to ang code. Okay? Next will be condition. The condition is executed once or each time to test the condition of the loop. This is very similar to what we call the if na statement, which is declare taog condition. If the condition is true, i-execute ang loop. Kung the condition is false, mugawa siya sa loop, meaning dili na siya magpadayon o pabalik-balik sa execution. Okay? That's the idea of the condition being utilized in loop. Si condition gigamit kang control structure sa decision the decision control structure is to verify lang to run the code or not. But here, identify niya kung mobalik ko ba siyang execute or muundang na siya sa iyahang loop. Okay? It continues execution until the condition is false and it must return a Boolean value. So we're going to use here the relational operators as well as, if necessary, the logical operators as well. Okay? Next is the increment and decrement. By the way, when we talk about the condition defines if magpadayon or ma-execute. So this is also the turning point sa tuang loop. Now, some nga mga kakasayop in terms of executing a loop is sayop ang ilang condition nga mahulog din sa tong ginatawag nga infinite loop, meaning dili mo abot sa certain criteria nga mo false ang condition, meaning magpadayon perminti ang loop, thus the term infinite loop. We're going to discuss more on that one once we do on the samples. The increment and decrement, As we all know, we have the plus and the minus. We have the pre-increment and post-increment and decrement, which already discussed in the previous chapters. So our variable values. Now, this makes the loop running. Okay? This will going to determine at some point na mo false siya sa atong condition, and at some point kung mogamit ta og iteration or defined iteration or fixed iteration, we are going to use very useful ni increment and decrement. The last will be the execution or kung sa atong ipa-execute. Okay? So naano siya depende sa structure sa atong gamiton na loop because there are different structures kang for, kang while, and do while. And again, kanilang siya nga statement or statements or block of codes will be executed niya balik-balik depende sa uban niya components. So kung false na itong condition, it will not going to continue to execute this one. Okay? So, we discussed kanina, while, do while, and for loop. Let's look ano yung mga components niya in these three types of loops in Java. For loop, we have here for. This one, indicated on the underline na color red, is what we call as the initialization. Okay? So meaning int I is equal to 0. That's basic declaration sa atong variable. Okay? Next will be I is less than 100, meaning this is now what we call as the condition nga component na dayon. Followed by the iteration, which is I++. This is what we call as the post increment. Okay? Meaning after anang align, mag +1 siya. Okay? And we have here the fourth one, which is a statement. I'm just letting you see ano yung mga components and asa gabutang ang mga components. Once we discuss for individual types of loops later, you're going to learn nga nung ingana pagkasulat-sulat din niya or pagkabutang sa iyang syntax. Okay? Next is for the while loop. So we are using the keyword no while. Okay? So we have the initialization, we have the condition, we have the iteration, lastly, the statement for the execution. Okay? So for do while, same, we have the initialization, we have the condition, we have the iteration, and we have the statement for execution. This, for example, this is what we call kanina, I discussed kanina regarding once we use do while, kapag si do while, unique si do while, again, ang atong timan-an nato ani is we are going to execute the statement at least once before execution. So that's why do, you execute this one first, then ay pa din siya i-condition. Unlike ang while loop kanina, which is this one, i-set siya condition daan ay ang execution. Okay? So at least, one time, mo execute ang imuhang code of statements nga identify sulod ning do nato nga block of codes. Okay? So, this is just introduction about loop. There will be an activity and there will be quiz also nga nakapost for this lesson.